Welcome back to Still Speak. This is episode 8 of my Summerwells series. If you've not seen the first 7 episodes, stop here, go give those a listen, and come back. It'll be easier for you to follow along in this episode. And for the rest, let's get back to it. Now, on the topic of where we left off in episode 7, I kind of want to discuss crime rate and registered offenders in the Rogersville, Tennessee area. Rogersville's crime rate is 108,000% higher than the national average. There is a 1 in 20 chance of being a victim of a crime. Crime rate of 50 per 1,000 residents. It has one of the highest crime rates in America compared to all communities of all sizes, from small towns to large cities. And the overall crime rate grade is a D-. A crime occurs every 9 hours and 29 minutes. A home in that area is 300% more likely to be robbed if they have no security system. Now, the site had a crime map with different colors. They have A+ for the color green, and C for the color yellow, and red for the grade of F. And Rogersville comes up mostly bright orange or an orange red, and even has some areas of red, which is an F. When you look at the map, it states that when looking at the rate of crimes per resident, it may appear inflated as they account for those who may be visiting the area and don't necessarily live there. Based on city data, there are 52 registered sex offenders. Of course, those are only ones in the database, and they don't include any potential offenders out there who may not have been caught or have offended yet. I pulled up Ben Hill Road, which is their road, and it shows me that 6 registered offenders live in a 5-mile radius of the Wells home. 29 of them live in a 10-mile radius. Half the offenders have offense dates of like the late 90s, early 2000s, and there's one that was in the 80s, and the rest are after 2004. Remember, they typically go on to reoffend. Just because they have an older offense date does not necessarily mean that they haven't done anything since then. They just might not have been caught for it, or that that means that, well, it can't be them because they haven't offended in 20 years or whatever. Now, I'm going to add to this. I'm highly suspect of someone who was staying in their area. I'm not going to say his name. He's already received a ton of hate, and I don't get down like that. If you follow the case closely, you'll know who I'm referencing without using his name. I had said in a prior episode that there could have been people who were staying out their way who maybe were not registered offenders, but an offender nonetheless. Being registered just means that they were caught. So there was an older man who was in the process of purchasing a few acres from the Wells neighbor, and the land is very near and or is connected, depending on which property line map you're looking at, to the Wells property. The purchase went through on June 1st, and he took possession of this land on June 7th, so 8 days prior to summer vanishing. Then allegedly, there was a dispute because he was upset about the property line and it not having any water access. And apparently, he was extremely pissed off about this. And it's been said that cops were called and he was asked to leave the property. And it's also been said, and take you what you want from it, but it was said that he was sleeping in his car on the land, and others said that he was camping. Whatever. He was staying on the land. But he supposedly did stay there, and into the 14th, and then into the 15th. He, when people, found out about this guy, then claimed on Facebook that he had left the Ben Hill Road area, which oddly, he called Ben Hell Road the day prior to summer missing, and went to a roadway inn for the entire day of the 15th. Now, this Google shows this roadway inn was actually condemned at one point due to very high crime volume, like rapes, and it was later reopened. And he said he only left the hotel twice to get biscuits and beer. Yum. 2 days later, after Summer went missing, he shaved off his beard and mustache, and it was a really, really long one, that he had for well over a year. And based off his Facebook, he left the state. Apparently, people who investigated him, and, they found out that he lives in Georgia. He has a home there. His wife filed for divorce at the beginning of August of this year, so just a couple of weeks ago. And once he got major pushback, or people were wondering if he was involved, he locked his Facebook profile completely down. This man said the police and TBI did interview him, and he said that he believes, that's not fact, he believes that he's been cleared by the TBI. But the TBI said a few weeks ago that no one's been cleared. Now, this is very alarming, and it's massive red flags to me. Massive. All of that, a total coincidence? I guess. It certainly doesn't look good. Can we agree on that? Now, let's move on. In a recent interview just about, a week and a half ago, today's August 30th, so it was about a week ago, Don mentioned him and Candace were not getting along lately. And this is actually normal. It happens in other cases involving a missing or murdered child. Not only do parents blame themselves when a child goes missing or is murdered, but they also can blame each other. So, for example, if one parent wasn't, watching the child as closely as they should have, the other parent blames them, or they blame themselves because they were like, well, if I would have been watching them more carefully, then they wouldn't have disappeared, etc. But besides blaming themselves or each other as possible reasons why, is that, there's a lot of stress involved here. And, sometimes you have one that's more depressed than another, or more stressed out than another. There might be arguments about what interviews to do and what not to do, and frustrations can build. And we all know that when, someone or even ourselves are stressed out, we usually take it out on the people closest to us, like our spouse. Many people think that a situation like this would draw people closer, and it has, but in many cases it does pull them apart. Now, they didn't seem to have some amazing, close, stable relationship to begin with, so that definitely doesn't help. And Don said, quote, "We will never be the same," unquote. And he's likely right. This is a traumatic experience which has affected every member of their family, and then some. Even if she's found safe and they're not involved, this experience will change them. You don't just pick up and move on forgetting something like this happened to your family. Yeah, you have to continue life, but this experience will always be there. It's life-changing. Slight detour. So I was doing some research, and I somehow, miraculously, I don't know how, stumbled on a handbook, and it's titled Investigative Case Management for Missing Children Homicides, and it's written by the Attorney General of Washington and U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I found a lot of interesting things in this handbook, and I clipped some because I wanted to share this, and we can see what's relative to the story, or we could keep these things in mind for other cases as well. And right in the introduction of this handbook, it debunks further the idea that parents don't process that fast. What we talked about in the other episode, at least I know I'm not the only, crazy one out there. And I went through my own personal experiences of processing really fast when I believe my child is missing. Well, it says right in this introduction, quote, "Every parent has felt their heart pound, their pulse quicken, their mind race, and their instinctual fear of losing a child strike them at the very instant it is recognized that their child is missing," unquote. Yeah. So why is Chris and this other expert saying it isn't? This literally is the introduction, and that is what it says. So, thank you, little handbook, for making me not feel like I'm crazy. Moving on, it says, Quote, homicide investigators, through no fault of their own, sometimes fail to realize that the investigations of the murders of abducted children are different from other murders they may investigate. Consequently, they sometimes make decisions about the direction of the investigation that are not high percentage choices. For example, some detectives believe that in any murder of a child, the logical suspect is a parent, and therefore devote a considerable amount of resources to prove that the killer was the father. But this research shows that the parents are the least likely suspects, in an abduction murder of a child. This kind of false assumption is made in part from lack of experience with these types of cases, and because there's no body of empirical research on these types of child murders and their investigations from which detectives can draw guidance. This research will help investigators make decisions, identify strategies, and implement tactics that will lead to the, more certain and timely capture of the killers of abducted children. And this report discusses the findings of a 3-year research, unquote. This was interesting. What stuck out to me was, we only see some cases, right? There's thousands and thousands of kids who go missing a year. Yeah. Kids are murdered by, hundreds, if not thousands, a year, okay? And we only hear about a few. And so it may be that in those few, the majority ended up being the parents, and therefore we all go around, myself included, saying, well, it's always the parents, so it's probably the parents, when this is actually saying that that's not true. So now if you think about that, more thoroughly, and you say, well, there's a lot more cases we don't know about, then yeah, you know what? That's actually technically not true, right? Because if you take all of the cases, probably, a small percent is the parents. Right? Because there's so many of them. So that's interesting. So, then they go on to list the criteria of what they were looking for, and they did this research based on 600 abducted kids. And he says the first criteria that the victim was younger than 18 years of age, whose body had been recovered, or if the body had not been recovered, the killer was identified, tried, and convicted. Number 2, the police agency receiving the initial contact about the case, whether as a missing, abducted, runaway, or dead body case, acted on the premise that abduction was a possibility. Number 3, the case was part of a series in which at least one victim in the series met the above stated criteria. The word abduction means different things to different people. For purposes of this research, it means 1, the victim was kidnapped. 2, the victim was detained or held against freedom of movement. Number 3, a victim of domestic violence was reported by the family as a missing child. Number 4, the police were initially of the opinion that the victim had been taken or held against their will, whether or not that turned out to be the case in the end. So, they go on to speak a bit about, each of these cases, which we're not going to go through all that. Maybe another day. That might be actually really interesting. And then they start going into, the data, right? So it says that 74% of the victims were dead within the first 3 hours, which we know, that's high. That happens a lot. And 91% of the victims were dead within 24 hours after being taken. We also know that. It's been said in, most documentaries or true crime shows, etc. Now, it says the victims of child abduction murders are very different than other murder victims who are typically young adult males killed by someone they know. Child abduction murder victims are more likely to be female children killed by strangers. And the victim can look like your next door neighbor. And then it goes on to say that most children that are abducted are female at 76%. Okay? So then it goes to talk about female victim-killer relationship, and they do it by age group. It says 1 to 5, 65% female victims, it was by a stranger. 27 was a friend of, the family or an acquaintance. 9% was the family or intimate relationship. Now that's for the 1 to 5 age group. We know that Summer is 5. And so based on this data, it's saying that 64% of females at 5 years old are abducted by a stranger in this research, and 27% by a friend of the family or an acquaintance, and 9% was family or intimate relationships. So that's really interesting data. Now for 6 to 9 year old range, it was 44% it was a stranger, 39% a friend or an acquaintance, or 17% the family or intimate relations. So then it goes on that, only 15% of these killers are married at the time of their murder. 73% are single and 13% are divorced. And that means that 85% of child abduction killers are not intimately attached or bonded to a significant other, partner, or spouse at the time of the abduction and murder of the child. Incredibly, 50% of the child abduction killers were unemployed at the time they committed the murder. When they were working, they were primarily employed in unskilled or semi-skilled labor occupations. It goes on to say, living arrangements of the killers living with the parents, 34%. Living alone, 17%. Living with a girlfriend or boyfriend, 16%. With spouse or children, 15%. With a roommate, 12%. Then he says, perceived lifestyle of killers described as strange, 40%. Alcohol abuser, 32%. Drug user and abuser, 27%. Friendly to children, 21%. Reclusive, 20%. Sexually promiscuous, 19%. Transient or semi-transient, 16%. Prior crimes against children by the killers, sexual assault, non-rape, 45% rape or attempted rape, 31% murder or attempted murder, 28% kidnap, 19% assault, 15% committed against children. Another characteristic that most of them share with serial murderers is a sexual component that their motivation to kill. In the case of child abduction murders, the overwhelming majority, 69% of the cases, involved a sexual motive, compared to only 5% of all murders and 14% of child murders. There are extremely big differences in the primary motive to commit murder. Almost one half, 48%, of the child abduction murders are classified as rape and 21% as other sexual assaults. As one would expect in these types of murders, a large group, 30%, are righteous kidnappings, which is 15 times greater than in all child murders and 30 times greater than in murders in general. It is one of the defining characteristics of child abduction murders. Some of the kidnappings may also include a secondary sexual component, because there is physical evidence that almost 2/3 of the child abduction murder victims had been sexually assaulted, compared to only 7% of all murder victims and 15% of all child murder victims. Again, these are dramatic differences in the role of sexual motivation and behavior across the different types of murder. That was a mouthful, but it's really interesting information. So then it goes on. There is a common belief that pornography plays an important role in the process of motivating sexual offenders and lust killers. The evidence simply does not support that conclusion regarding these child abduction killers. The role of pornography in the sexual motivation of these murders is insignificant. In only 4% of child abduction murders is there any evidence or indication that pornography was used as a trigger to motivate or initiate the murder. We suspect that these types of killers, their predisposition to engage in these types of violent and sexual acts with children, is a deep-seated element of their flawed characters, making the exposure to pornographic materials unnecessary in the process of getting motivated to commit murder. They do not need an external source to get ready to kill. Being ready is part of who they are. Can I get an amen on this? I love where they says, these types of violent and sexual acts with children is a deep-seated element of their flawed characters. 100%. And then it ends with, they don't need an external source to get ready to kill. Being ready is part of who they are. So that's pretty powerful stuff. So then he goes on to say how the killer chose his victim. Okay. Victim of opportunity was 57%. Prior relationship with the victim, 15%. Physical characteristics, 14%. And specific motivation, 13%. Post-offense behaviors of killers return to body disposal site, 22%. Left town, 21%. Confided in somebody, 18%. Followed case in the media, 17%. Contacted victim's family, 11%. Interjected themselves into the investigation, 10%. Problems caused by outside forces, so outside of law enforcement, was 24%. That would be YouTubers, the public, etc. Media, 19%. Family of the victim, 11%. Political pressure, 6%. And lawyers, 4%. Sorry, I had a kid come in there for a second. Gotta make do what I have, right? I have kids, and so we gotta kind of work around that. Anyways, they go on to talk about a red herring, and that's something that detracts attention from the matter or issue at hand. And they give examples of a red herring in the context of a murder investigation. You might be in a vehicle that detectives believe to be the killer's vehicle, and they, commit all this manpower to devote to finding this vehicle at the expense of other avenues of inquiry, only to learn later that the car was not involved. The victim's last known location is usually within a quarter mile of the initial contact site in 80% of the child abduction cases. Also, in 33% of the cases, the initial contact site is less than 200 feet from the victim's home, which makes me think of Jessica. In 58% of the cases, it's within a quarter mile of the victim's home. Curiously, though, these cases are most often stranger relationships, and in 18% of the cases, the killer lives less than 200 feet from the initial contact site. In 35% of the cases, he lives within a quarter mile. Yeah, this is based on only 600 cases, but 600 cases is a lot, and it is fascinating insight, and it's just something we can keep in mind. I want to point out that Hawkins County Sheriff's headquarters is near Kingsport, Tennessee, and so if they called, 911 around 6:27 p.m., it would have taken them, based on Google, about 35 minutes if they came from headquarters when the call came in. However, we all know that the police go out on patrol, and it's kind of unclear if an officer had been in that area or closer than the headquarters to, respond to that 911 call. And Don had told Chris the cops were not there when he arrived home. And remember, Don went to the bottom of the hill near the creek initially before he went up the driveway to the main home. Now, cops would not have been down there by the creek, yet they would have been up at the top of the house, where they would have been questioning the family. And we discussed Don going down there and how he said that he knew at that moment she was gone. His heart dropped, and in hindsight, it was all a blur. Now, when something like this happens, everything becomes chaotic. And in that chaos, sometimes it's hard, to remember or recall certain details. And for other people, it's in slow-mo. And you do remember everything. For others, while it is in slow-mo, it can also be kind of a blur, kind of when you see like a slow-mo part of a movie where all the sound around you becomes kind of muted. And Chris took the opportunity to call Don out and claim that he was told by law enforcement that they were there when Don arrived. And later somebody else asked Don about this conflict of information, and he said there may have been one cop up on the property, but he can't remember for sure because, again, it's a blur. Now, when he got to the creek where there were no cops, then technically when Don arrived home, that's where he was. And they weren't down there. You know what I'm saying? So given the cops were as far away, it's also possible that, Don and them were somewhat the same distance away, and they could have arrived at the same time or one right before the other. And, with Don going down there, he doesn't recall seeing them when he got up to the hill, but they could have been there, and doesn't necessarily mean he's lying, right? And I don't really think this is a big deal. And also, as time passes and, the memories become distorted, especially in circumstances like this. So maybe he just really doesn't remember seeing them. He doesn't recall it. Now let's discuss Candace. Again, at times, Dawn will come up with Candace. When I watched her interview with Chris as they toured the swimming hole that they went to that day, and then at the home, I got to admit I got zero vibes from her, and I believed her. She didn't strike me as some criminal, mastermind, and she told the story as thoroughly as she can remember it. And I actually want to thank Candace for opening up her home to us and putting herself out there. Many things stuck out to me, and one of those was when they arrived at the swimming hole, she was actually able to notice that the water level had changed since the month prior when they were there. And this is important because in Hunter's interview, he told of a story where he kind of implied Candace and Grandma Candy, weren't paying attention to Summer, but he was, and he saw Summer go under the water for a few seconds, and, he was the hero and went in and grabbed her, and she came up out of the water laughing. And there's a TikTok video, Summer that day in the water. It's not deep at all. Shallow water for sure. Maybe, tops waist high to her that she was splashing around in. But Candace had to be paying attention at some point because she noticed that the water level had changed. And she's right when you compare it to the TikTok video. It does appear like the water level has changed. Now, Dawn said everything after Summer went missing is a blur. And Candace, at the start of this interview, said everything that day prior to Summer going missing is in slow-mo. And that everywhere she looks, she sees her face. Now, Candace could be a criminal mastermind or manipulative or a liar, right? She could be. But I want you to consider something. When this interview took place, it was a day after, or a few days after, the three boys had been removed from the home. Okay? And when a criminal caves or confesses, it's usually due to, a lot of inside or outside pressure, of course, sometimes evidence, or they hit a point where they have nothing left, so they just cave in some situations. They sometimes cave to both, the pressure and feeling like they have nothing left, so they just kind of fold and say, I give up. So we have this woman who, is not well off financially, allegedly, does not have the greatest of marriages, allegedly. She has a missing daughter, that's not alleged, that's a fact. And her 3 sons were removed from her care. Fact. She doesn't work. Her mom left the state. Her home needs extensive work. And the public thinks she's the worst mother to ever walk the face of the planet, practically. And even police are considering her to be involved, right? Because they gave her a polygraph test, and she's the mom, and she was the last one to see Summer. So she's got a lot going on at once, right? And would be in a state where I personally would expect, especially now that Dawn is saying they don't get along like they used to as well, but I would expect to see her cave. And it's been roughly a month since that interview took place, and nothing in that situation, in her situation at all, has changed. And yet, she's not caved, and she's not confessed. And I think if there was any time for a confession, it'd be now or even a month ago when this interview took place. I mean, not all cases end in a confession, of course, but my thinking is this woman's likely not guilty because the most sane of people wouldn't be able to handle this amount of stress. Now, in cases where they don't confess but get caught because of buildup of evidence, that person typically does have a ton to lose if they confess. Now, you can look at Barry Morphew as an example. He's got 2 daughters, a business, family, friends, and so he stood to lose a ton to just cave, right? And then other people who end up confessing, they just might be in a point where they're like, I don't really have much left to lose here. I've already lost so much, so I'm just going to give up, throw in the towel, fold. Now, as far as any theory where there was some accident and she disposed of her body, I feel like Candace, besides me thinking she's not this criminal mastermind, but I don't think she's, I'm not convinced that she has the mental capacity to have a forethought to quickly dispose of her dead daughter. Now, when people are in a flight or fight situation, adrenaline's pumping, panic sets in, you're definitely far more capable of things that you normally wouldn't do or even consider. It becomes less about thinking and more about just doing. So it's slightly possible, but going off those things, you normally, go off of how she presents. I'm not seeing that in this case. Excuse me on that. Now, in order for that to have happened, one or more had to know about it. And this goes back to when, more involved, the higher the risk of being caught. You all need to be on the same page and tell the exact same story and trust one another not to give one or all of you up. If the boys told detectives something different than what Don and Candace have said, there's absolutely no question that the cops have been riding their asses and trying to apply as much pressure as possible to get them to confess, right? They'd be like, your boys said this, your boys said that. And they've actually might have used that technique and lied to them and said the boys said something different and they just weren't buying it and didn't cave, right? But they would have cornered them on that information if the boys had said something different. The property has a circular driveway, and you actually see in the video parts of it is gravel, or most of it is gravel, and you can even hear the sound of driving on the driveway in Chris's video. It's very loud. So in order to go hide her, she would have needed to use a car, which most likely would have been heard by Grandma or the boys. And I mean, she could have walked off with her, but that would have taken time, and Summer would have been dead weight, and that would mean she was disposing of her either on the property or very close to the property, and would also mean that she take the risk of somebody seeing her walking in or around the property when it was still daylight out, carrying her dead daughter. Now, search crews and dogs and helicopters, they might, they would have spotted her. I mean, this isn't like Jessica Lunsford, who was 65 yards away, but she was inside a home. This would have been outside, like in the woods or in the brush or off the side of the road. Her body's kind of just out there, laying there. So some believe that, Candace did this, that she covered up the death of her daughter because she feared CPS. But I said in another episode, they called the police, which is as bad, if not worse, than CPS. And Candace knows CPS and police work together. She has prior experience in this from her first 2 kids, which we'll get into about later. So I can't believe a theory that all the people on the property are in on this master plan to hide their dead sister, dead daughter, and dead granddaughter to protect one person. Now, if it had only been Candace at home that day, that would be more believable. And hiding her body out of fear of, CPS just isn't fitting. And what I said in the other episode was that if she did hide her, but didn't report her until a month later, then I would say for sure that's a possibility, but that's not what happened. That's what Casey Anthony did. Now, Casey Anthony wasn't fearful of CPS. And I'm talking about Casey Anthony like we all think she's guilty, because I sure hope we all know that Casey Anthony is guilty. But, she came, didn't report her, and she had this elaborate story, I was looking for her on my own. So now if Candace would have, disposed of her body and then we didn't hear about it for a month, like, oh, my daughter went missing a month ago, then I would have been like, oh yeah, definitely, because she didn't want them coming to the house and taking the other kids, and it just would be more believable to me. Now let's discuss some other things that stood out to me when watching and listening to Candace with Chris. When she took Chris down to the basement, she mentioned that she had actually moved 2 of the boys downstairs to the basement to sleep after Summer went missing. One of the boys, the second youngest of the family, already had been sleeping down there with Summer. This statement showed me that she has learned from this experience and had concerns about her other children, enough to move them downstairs with her and Don. And when she took Chris out the back door of the basement to show him outside, she mentions not remembering if the door had been locked or not. And Don said in prior interviews it was open. When Don got home that day, the door would have been unlocked because Candace went out that door to look for Summer, right? So he might have been thinking that it was open because of Summer, not realizing that it was, Candace. But I I don't really find this to be a red flag. I mean, it just could be a detail that's not sticking out to her because she was already in a panicked moment looking for her, and she just kind of pushed the door open and doesn't, remember exactly whether or not she had to unlock it. Now, all my kids can easily unlock and open a door at 5, and when she unlocked this door and opened it, it didn't seem hard at all to do. At all. Like, super easy. Now, what caught my attention was when she walked Chris outside through that door, while they continued talking and filming, she took a few moments to stop and lock that door, which again shows me that she has a concern now about that door since Summer went missing. And the boys were out of the home, and yet she still took the time to lock it, which shows me that she's probably formed a habit of doing such. The only real way for Summer to get out would have been through that basement door. Another option is an upstairs window, but I mean, the odds of that is incredibly low. I mean, she also could have gone out of the front door, because her brothers were upstairs by the door, and, I don't know, if they weren't paying attention, and maybe Grandma and Candace were in the trailer, not outside the trailer, so, I mean, maybe she could have just kind of snuck past everybody, but I doubt it. It's much more believable that she went out that door, either on her own or forcefully, because it's the opposite side of the house at the bottom of the slope, completely out of sight. I think this door is key to the story. It can even be slightly key in a theory that involves Candace being involved. Let's say she did all she claimed and then, add to the story that she went downstairs, found her, or harmed her, right? And she could have removed the body out that door, and no one would have seen her. And then she would have came back upstairs through that staircase and say, oh, Summer's missing. The issue with this is Dawn had her Subaru, which would not have been, she wouldn't have been able to take Grandma's car, because then Grandma would have known that she was going to do something. And we don't know, if she had access to Dawn's work truck keys, and if it was downstairs or not. Then that means she would have to go upstairs and get the keys, and then the boys would see her, and then she'd have to go back downstairs, and then she'd have to take her body, and then she'd have to leave the property. That's if the keys are even there. And then somehow drive off the property and be gone for a period of time. Let's say drive 10 miles, get her out of the car, dump her on the side of the road, get back in the car, make sure she's cleared off all the evidence, and then drive back. Right? But people would have heard her leaving the property because of the gravel. It's very loud. You can hear it in Krista's interview. They would have heard her leaving and entering the property, Grandma or the boys. I mean, we can keep it on the list, but it's just not fitting for me. Not yet. Based upon what we know, it's not fitting. In Candace's tour with Chris of the property, 3 big areas stuck out to me and a few other small areas. An abandoned school bus located close to her swing, a little cove area to the left of that door if you're walking out the door, and lastly, if you look at the thumbnail from my episode 7 of Summer Swinging, you could see in the far back there's a shed directly behind her, and a window can be seen looking in the direction of that swing. These areas really lead me to believe it's likely or possible she was abducted, and we're going to get into that into the next episode, or the last one before we end the Summerwells series. But somebody could have been on that bus. Somebody could have actually even been hiding behind a tire of that bus. And with the amount of stuff that is on their property and around the bus, you would never have even noticed somebody standing there. And tires on school buses are really big, and somebody standing behind that, you wouldn't be able to visibly see them. Okay? There's also an old generator they could have been hiding behind. There was also the shed behind the swing. There's this cove area that Candace says they built, and it was an addition to the house, and it's right under their house, and she talks about there being puppies down there. But it's right next to the door downstairs by the basement. So these are all areas that on a property like this, with the amount of stuff laying around and the overgrown trees, grass and trees and what have you, that somebody can easily hide and they wouldn't be seen. It's not far-fetched at all. So let's end there, and then we'll pick up in the next episode, because my kids are ready for me to be done, and then we'll talk about that some more. Until next time, thanks.